Cherien, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today about All That's Left of You. I am so blown away by this film. It's absolutely one of the best films I've seen in ages. I was able to catch the film at Telluride. Yeah, I was really just blown away by the epic scope, this multi-generational story. So there's a lot to dig into. So thanks for talking with me about the film.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, because there is so much to dig into, I do want to just start right at the beginning. Where did this project originate for you?
I started thinking about making a multi-generational family epic, I'd say, really after I made my first two feature films. I knew I always wanted to kind of tackle the story of sort of the origin of Palestinian displacement, how it all began, what happened in 1948, because I grew up, I was born and raised in the US, but kind of returning to Palestine often. And I just always grew up wondering why people didn't really know what happened in 1948 from the Palestinian perspective. So it was always something that was kind of in my consciousness. And after I made my first two features, I thought, okay, I'm ready to kind of do something bigger. I want to do something totally different than what I've done. And I feel ready to take on something that could be kind of monumental for me in terms of what I've done thus far. And so I really started thinking about how to approach that story. And, there's the parts of the story that are kind of from my own lived experience, just as someone who grew up visiting Palestine and kind of getting a window into life under occupation, and also someone who witnessed kind of the pain of my father. My father's from the West Bank, and he was exiled in 1967. So, automatically became a refugee, and it took him about 10 years to get foreign citizenship in order to return just to visit his family and the only home he'd ever known. And so, this was obviously a source of great heartache and pain for him, which was effectively passed down to my siblings and I. And so there was kind of the pain of exile, of returning to Palestine, only to feel like an outsider, only to feel like you're watching kind of the disintegration of your homeland. So there were the things that the stories that I really lived with and knew, like inherently or personally. And then there were the stories that lived in me, the stories that I grew up hearing and that I really wanted to also put in the film. Because essentially, a movie with this level of scope that covers almost 80 years of history from the point of view of one family and showing how one family survives all of these decades of political upheaval. We've never seen that before. And so I wanted, and I kind of knew that this would be the story of a Palestinian family that would in some ways be the story of all Palestinian families.
Yeah, I was going to ask if it always was in your mind a multi-generational story, or if it had started as just a story set in the 40s, or was it, so it was always this epic scope for you?
It was always this epic scope because in a way, one of the things that I was really motivated by was really taking a look at the inheritance of that pain and or heartache that I was talking about, like the inheritance of trauma, the inheritance of being Palestinian, and how it's passed down from generation to generation. So I always knew that it was multi-generational, and I always knew that I wanted to look at, the stories of the grandfather, the father, and the grandson.
It's so effective. And I honestly haven't stopped thinking about the first lines that your character speaks in the film. You speak directly to camera in English, and it sets the tone for the film. It really felt like you were speaking to me, to people like me, like you said, who grew up not necessarily learning this history, which is so often the case. Tell me about crafting that opening with the shooting and then going into your character speaking directly to camera like that.
That was like one of the first images that came to me. And it was really inspired by something I experienced when I was in Palestine, prepping my first feature film, America, in 2000, I want to say 2007, 2008, something like that. I was based in Ramallah, which is where we were prepping. And I was there for early prep. So my team wasn't quite there yet. I had arrived, and I took the bus to Jerusalem to pick up my rental car, and I was driving back into Ramallah. And suddenly the checkpoint was closed, and the soldiers were trying to reroute everyone, the Israeli soldiers at the Kalendia checkpoint. And I was like, I'm staying there. Like I have to go through. And they were like, go at your, enter at your own risk. And everything was just chaotic. There were just cars everywhere. It was like horrible traffic, people and I was like, what is going on? And so I took a little minor detour because they made me, and I, kind of drove around the checkpoint and then into the checkpoint, only to see that there was black smoke everywhere, and there was fire that had kind of been started in these tires everywhere, and just droves of people like coming to the checkpoint. And then I look to my left and I see like a line of Palestinian, like I would say like teenagers and young men, like with rocks in their hands. And then I look and I see that directly in front of them are Israeli soldiers with their, M16s pointed at them. And I realize that I'm like directly behind the line of young men. And I'm just staring at the scene. And it just felt super surreal. Like that image really stayed with me. That image of like, who are these young men? Like, why are they there? And some of them look quite young. I mean, they might have been boys, I'm just looking at them from behind, and it all happened so quickly. And I was just like, why don't we know who they are? And why don't we know how they got there? And why don't we know how their families got to the their families ended up in the refugee camps as refugees? And so as I was thinking about the story, just that image just kept coming up for me very strongly. It's an image I've been watching on Western media from the time I was a kid growing up in the US, and no one really understands the context of that image, and we've been seeing it since the first Intifada. So I kept thinking about that. And then it just came to me that in order to tell the story of how, if we were to follow one of these teenagers, to tell the story of how he arrived there, how he got there, how he ended up in front of those bullets, then, we have to tell the story of the grandfather. And who better to kind of set that up than the mother? Yeah. So it just, I think, this is a film that, like I said, I started thinking about it like back in 2014 or something, and it had a really long gestation period, which turns out is a really nice thing when you're trying to be creative, because things just kind of start coming to you,
Yeah, I want to ask about that long gestation period and the ways that how has this film shifted, from 2014? What are the biggest shifts for you, whether it be in the story itself, how the story has maybe changed direction, or anything else for you in this last decade of making this film?
Well, the film gestated for quite a long time, and I actually didn't even sit down to start writing it until 2020. So the gestation period of like 5 or 6 years was really me thinking a lot about it, making notes about the characters, kind of allowing images to come to me, and then thinking about how those images might relate to this story. Really thinking about how do I jump time periods, because of the structure of the film was somewhat clear to me. I knew I had to tell the story of how the teenager ended up in front of that bullet. So I knew I had to jump back to 1948, and then kind of figuring out where to go from there, which time periods to cover. I immersed myself in research. I was reading kind of nonfiction, fiction, just to really let myself be in those different time periods and remember all of the different, I say remember, but it's not like I was even alive. But I've heard so much about these different time periods that in a way it was like part remembrance and part just like, I don't know, ancestral knowledge, coming through me or something. But I really immersed myself to understand the different attitudes during those different time periods. So when I sat down to start writing in 2020, it really flowed out of me in a way that I've never experienced before. And I would say that I didn't do that many drafts of the script before I took it out, which was amazing, because that, again, was not my experience with previous features, and that I was getting a very strong reaction from the script. I think that once I started prepping it on the ground, so I went to Palestine in May of 2023 to kind of start early prep. And that was when the script started to really shift and change. And, when I was there with surrounded by the people who were going to work on the film, who started sharing their own stories and their own experiences, then the script just really, I think, deepened in layers and nuance and specificity in a way that was so beautiful, in a way that, it's like I have to give credit to like my whole community for helping me write this thing because it became so layered. I could have never done that on my own. And then I would say that, we fled Palestine. We were forced to flee, evacuate after the events of October 2023. And we found ourselves, telling a story about what was happening kind of as it was happening. And I think the intensity of that, well, nothing changed really materially about the script. The scripts remained kind of as it was written. I think that the emotionality of it deepened. And I think the tone in certain places really became even more nuanced because I realized that some of these interactions were going to be a little bit trickier in this kind of new world that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, I have to ask about where that film ends in 2022. And it's hard to not feel even further devastated knowing what's about to happen not long after the story ends. I know, obviously, you were prepping. You had written the film prior to all those events, prior to the current genocide in Palestine.
Right.
Did you ever consider extending the story to somehow touch on what's happening right now?
Right after it happened and we fled and things really began to escalate and Gaza was being bombarded and we were watching, we were kind of watching it all happen. So I think it was maybe late October. I really did consider it. But then I thought, I'm already covering like 80 years of Palestinian history. And the important thing is that all of this happened before October of 2023 and I think that's something people don't realize. And so the film actually where the film ends now is 2022, but it was supposed to say present day. But I actually decided that's the one thing about the script that did change. So there was one material change, which is just I took present day and I made it 2022 to make it really clear that all of this happened before the events of October 2023. And also because I don't know, at the end of the movie, the characters return to their homeland. And I don't know that they could have done that. Like, I wasn't sure where this was going. I didn't know if they would want to return or be able to return. In the current landscape, I just didn't know what was going to happen. So I thought, you know what, let me end this before all of that, because all of these events did happen before all of that.
That's good. In addition to your incredible script, what brings this to life so well is your incredible cast. Having Salah, Mohammad, and Adam portraying this father and son in and of itself is incredibly moving, having it be this family experience portraying this. All three of them have incredible careers on their own, but to come together in this is really powerful. Salah's performance in particular is just one of the best I've seen in a very long time. Tell me about casting this film, those three in particular, but also assembling your entire cast, and how you knew they were right for these roles.
Well, when I started writing it and I knew it was, this intergenerational story, I couldn't help but think of them, of course, because, there's only one acting dynasty in Palestine, and it is the Bakri family, And Mohammad Bakri is just a legend and someone I've always loved and admired and just watched. And so I thought, oh man, if he could play older Sharif, that would be just phenomenal. And then I kept imagining, Saleh as his son in the 1970s, and then, Adam playing the part in the 1940s. And so they were really in my mind as I was writing. The bigger challenge was just their availability. There was a moment where I didn't think I was going to, Saleh wasn't available, and I didn't think I was going to be able to cast him. And so it was tricky. And then somehow miraculously it all worked out in the end that he was able to do it. And, so the casting was tricky in that I had to kind of figure out an alternative plan, but the alternative plan was just never for me. I really wanted this to be an intergenerational portrait, both on and off screen. So I was just so grateful that it worked out, that they could do it. And, Saleh and Adam, their mother comes from Jaffa, and they lived in Jaffa, which is, the city where the film opens up and where the family is originally dispossessed. So it was I think it was really important for them to do it. I think they felt really connected to that story. And it was amazing to work with them. I mean, the three of them are so different, but each so brilliant and big-hearted.
Well, the film is also stunning to look at. I mean, the way you capture all of these different decades is really soulful and rich. Tell me about working with your DP, Christopher, and what you wanted this film to look like.
Yeah, working with Christopher was amazing. I mean, we spent a lot of time going through every scene of the script and really talking about, the details and, of course, the overall. We really wanted the film to have, despite the fact that it takes place in 4 different time periods, and we wanted each time period to be visually distinct, we really wanted the film to have this overall cohesion so that it felt like a film and not, kind of episodes of something. So we, with regard to the visual style, we chose to shoot digitally, but on the Arri Alexa, which is a little bit more filmic, on anamorphic lenses, so that we could really kind of get that more like vintagey feel. We wanted it to feel really epic and intimate at the same time. So really sweeping wide shots, but also really close in with our characters. And the way that we chose to kind of differentiate each time period was just simply through color palette and camera movement. So once we kind of came up with those ground rules, then we could do almost anything, within each time period with regard to, kind of color and movement, just to sort of differentiate it. But overall, it had this, kind of cohesive, almost classic movie feel, which I think was intentional. We were looking at a lot of Hollywood epic films and how they were shot. And I know I always, having grown up with a lot of those epics, I always wanted there to be a kind of Palestinian epic in that classic Hollywood style.
Tell me more about the way you differentiated camera movements in each decade. What was different about the way the camera moved in each of those times?
Yeah, so in 1948, the camera's a bit more stable. It's a bit more still. It has more stability. It's a little bit. It starts off kind of a little further away, a little less intimate, a little more objective, and then once we start getting into the 1970s in the refugee camp, we're on Steadicam a lot more. We've got some handheld in that wedding. We kind of go between sort of Steadicam and handheld quite a bit. The camera starts to get closer to our characters, so we're feeling a little bit more claustrophobic as we end up in this camp where we don't have as much space. Everything is so much more cramped, And then in the 80s, it's similar, but with a little bit less handheld, less frenetic, a little bit more Steadicam, but still kind of keeping that sort of rebellious energy of the first Intifada, which is the 1980s. But then again, we go into some stillness in a portion of the film where it starts to feel a little bit more meditative as our characters are kind of waiting and, going through a bureaucratic process. So we sort of have a mix of some of the 48, with a little bit more stillness, but with, kind of, again, that claustrophobic feel, where we're closer to our characters and we're not getting as wide a sense of the world anymore. And then at the end of the movie, we're in 2022 and the camera's again a little bit further away, a little bit more objective and much more polished as it was at the beginning of the film, as it kind of goes back to this formal feel, and our characters are, sort of fish out of water, like in their homeland, feeling like outsiders.
Well, I believe you said earlier that you were intending to shoot this in Palestine, but that obviously became difficult after October 2023. Tell me about moving locations and finding the spaces to shoot. Like you said, this is a very epic scope, lots of locations, lots of big wides. Where did you find the right locations for this film?
It was quite a challenge. Once we fled, we went to Cyprus, where we had actually always planned to shoot around 10% of the film. So all of those big scenes that might have been not, unsafe to shoot in Palestine, we were planning to shoot in Cyprus. So for example, our prison camp in 1948, we actually shot in a real prison camp in Cyprus that was built by the British and housed the Cypriot fighters in the 1970s. So some of those locations we had, and we were very lucky in that when we fled, we had a place to go and a place where we had already been kind of laying some groundwork. And so we went there. We had to add a lot more prep. I mean, fleeing Palestine was devastating in so many ways. I mean, I think the biggest heartbreak about it was leaving our Palestinian crew behind, a group of people that we had been prepping with for months and who were so excited about working with us on this historic Palestinian film and who had already been working so hard. For example, we had amassed a giant warehouse of carefully crafted and curated props and set dressing from all of the different time periods and things that had never been seen in cinema before, like, things from 1948. And, it was a really exciting prep in Palestine. So, we went to Cyprus and we ended up shooting what we had intended to shoot there, which were some of those wider shot scenes. And then I think we were always hoping to return to Palestine, but, it became clear that we weren't going to be able to. So we went to Jordan. We shot most of the film in Jordan. So a little over 50% were shot in the refugee camps in the north of Jordan. And we found 2 refugee camps that actually really had not changed that much from the 1970s and 80s. I mean, they were very well preserved, almost better preserved from that time period than anything we found in Palestine. In Palestine, the camps just kept growing and growing and growing, almost to the point where they look like cities these days. Quite cramped. I mean, where sometimes buildings are so close together, you have to turn sideways to walk through them. Jordan the refugee camps there were made for great locations. And in some ways, it felt like a return to Palestine because we were shooting with our community. But it's, one of the camps had housed refugees from 1948. And another one called the Gaza refugee camp housed refugees from Gaza from 1967. So that's where we shot most of the film. And then we finally finished the film in Greece, in both Athens, where we shot the kind of Tel Aviv, a lot of the Tel Aviv Haifa portions of the film, and then Rhodes Island, which is where we shot the old city of Jaffa. So it was, a production that should have taken us about 3 months took us about 11 months because we were stopping and starting and trying to figure out where to go next and then trying to raise more money. And essentially, we shot the entire film in a state of crisis.
I read a quote from you elsewhere where you said, in your own words, that you didn't feel mature enough to tell this story earlier in your career. Tell me what made you feel that way then, and then how you knew the time was right.
I think there's a level of artistic maturity one has to have just to personally feel ready to take on something as big as this kind of movie, multi-generational, covering 80 years of history, taking place during all of these different time periods. I think it was a lot of story for me to track in my own mind, and I think I needed to kind of mature as a storyteller in order to really tackle that and figure out how best to do it, but also to have the courage to make bold choices in a film that's not super traditionally structured. And I hadn't personally seen a film that was structured in quite this way with these kinds of jump cuts. So I wanted to wait to make sure I felt confident enough in my ability as a filmmaker to really kind of make choices that were bold and that I felt confident enough to make it work. Because so much of what we do is just about you make a choice and then you really do everything you can to make that choice work. And if you have any hesitation, it's not going to work. You know what I'm saying? So I think part of it was really about that. And I think the other part of it was really about taking on a story that in many ways is still taboo to talk about in the Western world. I think that the Nakba, I certainly grew up in the US feeling like I couldn't talk about it in certain circles. And when I did, it was not a good result. Often. So I wanted to, again, make sure that I was emotionally prepared to take on whatever backlash I was going to potentially take on by telling the truth of what happened to Palestinians in 1948. Of course, I had no idea that the world would be as ready as it is right now to hear it, because I do think that, like I said, when I wrote this, it was 2020. When I conceived of it, it was 2014. the only thing that's changed now is there's been a massive acceleration of things that have been happening since 1948. And I'm in some ways just really grateful to have the vehicle of this movie to pour my energy into, because it's the one thing that's making me feel a little less helpless at this time. And I think it's also vital in a way, this film now, because it really allows you to understand how we got to where we are right now. As we're watching this genocide unfold in Gaza, and the world is trying to understand how this happened, this movie provides vital context that as of yet has been untold, especially in this way, this sweeping way, talking about the ongoing Nakba and something that started in 1948 but has continued until now.
And it does so in both an educational way and entertaining way, and it is incredibly moving. So grateful for the film. Well, last question before I let you go, Cherien. It's not often that I get to interview a fellow Ohioan about film. Thinking back across your career, this is your third feature film, and of course, so much TV work, including your Emmy-nominated work on Only Murders. Growing up in Ohio, how do you see your early years in Ohio shaping the filmmaker that you are today?
I love that question, because I really actually think my upbringing in Ohio shaped me in a massive way. I think I would say kind of two key ways. One is that I grew up in a really small town in the northwestern corner called Salina. I don't know where you're from, but have you heard of Salina?
Of course, absolutely.
Yeah. Where are you from?
I'm from Cincinnati, the suburbs of Cincinnati. Yeah.
Okay, I did my undergrad at the University of Cincinnati.
Yes, I know. Yeah.
So there you go. So I grew up in a town of 10,000 people, and there was nothing to do. And my parents bought a camcorder when I was 12 years old. So I took that camcorder and I started recording things. And, my mom wanted me to record boring things like Christmas parties and birthdays. And to make it interesting for myself or entertaining for myself, I started telling people what to do and say on camera. And that turned into making short films with my friends and my sisters. So really, I think that was something that was really shaped by growing up in a town where there just was not a lot to do. But I think the second way that it shaped me was that, like I said, this town, is quite small, and my family was one of a very small handful of immigrant families. And so, for the most part, we were kind of exotified, but we blended in okay, and all of that shifted radically during the first Gulf War. So my dad, who's a doctor, lost a lot of his patients because people decided to boycott him. We got death threats on a daily basis. The Secret Service came to my high school to investigate a rumor that my older sister threatened to kill the president. So it was a time of really intense racism and discrimination. And I was a freshman in high school at that time. So I was really shocked by what was happening and what I was seeing. And, every evening, my parents were whispering about moving to Cleveland or just moving away, going to a bigger city, just leaving. And I remember really just being obsessed with this question of why. Like, why do people suddenly believe that we're a threat? We've lived in this town with them for 10 years. And my dad, I used to walk through town and people would stop me sometimes and be like, hey, your dad saved so-and-so's life, like my son's life or whatever. And suddenly he was a terrorist to them. And that was when I really woke up to the power of film and television and the fact that the stereotypes that were being perpetuated about us were directly impacting my family. And that was when I realized how absolutely dangerous those stereotypes were. And I vowed to do something about them. So I think that was the moment where that spark was just lit. And I knew I had to become a filmmaker. So it was no longer about just making horror movies in the cornfields of Ohio with my friends. It was about really, having a mission and telling authentic stories about my own community.
Well, I cannot wait for more people to see all that's left of you. It is truly incredible. So thank you so much, Cherien, for your time and for this film. It really is amazing.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate you.